It's no secret that many Christians, and especially apologists, don't take Jesus' mythicism seriously. In fact, many atheists don't either, which is why they often claim that no one actually believes that Jesus didn't exist. But that's a different topic. Now, since many don't take it seriously when apologists do decide to address the topic, the responses aren't all that serious either. For instance, let's see how Mike Jones of Inspiring Philosophy tackles the claim.
Did Jesus even exist?
John Dominic Crossan said, Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be.
There's a few things we can unpack here. For one, Mike just resorts to a logical fallacy and appeal to authority. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Isn't he just citing a source? No, it's clearly an appeal to authority. The difference is that he's not actually citing any evidence. He's not creating an argument. He's simply saying, well, here's a scholar who says it definitely happened. The choice of John Dominic Crossan here does seem a bit weird, as I'm sure Mike disagrees with Crossan more than he agrees with him. After all, Crossan argues that the body of Jesus was probably consumed by dogs after the crucifixion. But I digress. Now for two, to jump straight to claiming that the crucifixion is historical is largely missing the mark, largely because the argument for the crucifixion is based on the prior assumption that Jesus in fact existed. It's just completely ignoring the actual topic at hand. Honestly, I'm not sure why that was his go-to, but let's look at some more of the arguments.
Number 1, he was supposedly a Hebrew man, yet we call him Jesus.
They don't get translated, they get transliterated.
Okay, so there is a reason why mythicism often isn't taken seriously. It's because there are some very poor arguments for it, such as this one. To be fair though, Christians also tend to get this whole naming issue wrong as well. So let's break it down. Mike is right here when he says that the names get transliterated, not translated. But there's more here as well. 1. Jesus was Jewish and most likely spoke Aramaic as his mother tongue, not Hebrew. A minor thing, but still worth pointing out. 2. It may be worth mentioning that the reason we call Jesus Jesus and not Joshua, even though the two names are the same in Aramaic and Hebrew, is because of the path both took during the transliteration process. Joshua comes from the Hebrew form, while Jesus comes from the Greek form. It's why we get the difference here, but enough of that. Let's see what the other arguments are.
Number 2, the entire New Testament was written in Greek. So everything that we know about Jesus is filtered through Roman eyes.
The Romans' main language was Latin, and they did not write the New Testament.
Well, we have a 2-for-1 here. Now, it's understandable to have concerns about the language. Jesus' mother tongue was probably Aramaic. However, there's a good case that can be made for him having known at least some Greek. This doesn't necessarily make matters all that much better though, largely because it would have been in Aramaic that he preached in anyways. So the Greek argument here doesn't add much to the discussion, but it is interesting. At the same time, the difference in language here isn't a major hurdle. After all, we are just talking about a translation process, and we know that being fluent in both Aramaic and Greek wasn't unheard of. We can assume that Paul would have known both, as he did write his letters in Greek, and we can be certain that he knew Aramaic, as he seemingly conversed freely with the brother of Jesus, James, as well as the disciples of Jesus. Since these individuals were from Palestine, where Aramaic was a lingua franca, or the common language, we can safely assume that they both in fact spoke primarily Aramaic. We also have Josephus here, who wrote his Jewish wars originally in Aramaic, and then translated it into Greek. He actually tells us of this process. So the process of going from one language to another isn't a major hurdle. Beyond this, we do have hints of some Aramaic underlying. Throughout the Gospels, we do have a number of Aramaic words and phrases that appear. This could suggest that we are looking at an Aramaic source here. Maurice Casey, in his book, Aramaic Sources of Mark's Gospel, takes this a bit further. Building on prior work, Casey's argument is that there is an Aramaic source for at least parts of Mark. Part of the reason for this view is that we have passages in Mark that appear to make more sense in Aramaic. They show signs of having been translated from Aramaic. Casey, taking this view, goes on to actually reconstruct 4 such passages. We also have what appears to be some external evidence that there were at least some Aramaic sources that were circulating early on as well. Papias tells us of a Gospel of Matthew that was written in the Hebrew dialect, which probably meant Aramaic here. Now, the Gospel of Matthew that we have today was not originally Aramaic, but it's quite possible that he had another source attributed to Matthew, one that may have been used by the author of our Matthew. The point largely is that we have reason to assume here that there was at least some Aramaic sources that were circulating around. What of Mike's argument, though? Well, it's historically incorrect. While the official language of the Romans was Latin, Greek was the common language throughout much of the empire. This is especially true when we focus on Palestine and that larger area. It's why Josephus, a Roman historian, wrote in Greek. So the fact that the Gospels were written in Greek, not Latin, isn't actually an argument against them being filtered through Roman eyes. A better argument here is simply realizing that the Romans didn't really care. It wouldn't be until centuries after Jesus that Rome would really take notice. Up until then, Christians were seen first as Jews, and then once they broke away, they were largely seen as some fringe sect of what many people thought were crazies. Let's move to point 3 though.
3. There are 0 writings from Jesus himself.
Most people in the ancient world didn't write anything about themselves.
Mike actually nails this one. Most people in the ancient world didn't write anything themselves, even if they existed. Now, it would be great if Jesus had actually written something out. Having his exact words from his own hand would be amazing, but often history doesn't provide us with such sources. So it's on to point 4. Can Mike keep it up?
4. The earliest Gospels were written decades after he supposedly died.
And that also doesn't mean Jesus didn't exist.
Let me be fair, I did cut up this video a bit, but this really isn't a misrepresentation of the sort of rhetoric that Mike uses. It's a blatant dismissal that really doesn't dive into the heart of the problem. Instead, he largely just ignores the point by hand-waving it away. Now the original creator makes a credible point. The Gospels are written decades after the fact. This can seem like an issue, especially when we consider modern history, where we are constantly documenting everything. But in the ancient world, we are largely talking about oral societies, societies that were, by large, illiterate, societies that passed on information not through the written record, but through oral tradition. Now, this does cause a number of problems for historians. John Dominic Crossan in The Birth of Christianity spends a good amount of time looking at this topic. What we get from this analysis of various studies done on oral tradition is that the traditions is rather accurate at its core, but the details get fuzzy. To put this into perspective, we can look at the sayings attributed to Jesus. What this would mean is that the exact wording doesn't go back to Jesus himself. The speeches aren't accurate in the sense that they didn't preserve what Jesus was literally saying, word for word. But instead, the actual message Jesus was preaching is still preserved. James D.G. Dunn refers to this as oral flexibility. We aren't getting a teaching from Jesus word for word, but we are getting the gist and substance of that teaching. In essence, it's the same teaching but phrased differently. It also means that the details of the story can also get a bit fuzzy. While oral tradition keeps the gist of the story, the fine details can change. It's part of the reason we often get loose language within the oral tradition. Instead of having exact numbers, we get numbers that are more vague or that are symbolic. This is also why Jesus most likely spoke in parables, because parables lend themselves quite well to oral tradition. Parables are short, they're easy to memorize, and they are designed to be performed for others. This makes them all an ideal vehicle to pass on oral tradition. And we have to realize that this isn't something that's unique when it comes to Jesus. It's what is common in the ancient world, so this isn't a unique situation for Jesus. Now, we could also point out that it's possible we had earlier records that now don't exist, as we know some Christian writings just weren't preserved. We actually have Paul himself referring to letters that we no longer have. But I think that's enough of this point. The conversation continues, so let's see how it goes.
By anonymous actors, because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not actually written by those disciples.
The unanimous attestation from church fathers is that those are the 4 gospel authors.
Who wrote the Gospels is a very interesting question. There are many ways to address this concern. On the bottom of that list, in my opinion, would be to simply say that the church fathers said it was so. Instead, we could point out that many works were circulated without an author attached to them. Part of this had to do with the way many works were constructed, as writing was often a collaborative effort. We know that often the so-called author of a work was more of a compiler. They weren't necessarily writing something of their own, as they were collecting from other places and compiling these other works into one. So having an anonymous gospel really isn't that unique. It's more what historians would expect from this time and place, which means we have to be careful not to retroject our own modern views that place more of an importance on authorship, into the past. In the same vein, we also know that it was often common to later attribute a work to a certain individual in order to give them additional authority, which means we have to be more careful when we try to make the claim that since the church fathers claim these are the authors, it must be so. But we have additional issues with said claim, because it's not until 180 AD that we get Irenaeus naming all of the Gospels. Prior to that, we do have certain hints, but not anything really definitive. For instance, Justin Martyr speaks of the memoirs of the apostles, but he doesn't tell us which apostles. If we look at the apostolic fathers, who were among the earliest church fathers and were writing largely in the first half of the 2nd century, we don't find any of them really naming the Gospels, meaning the claim that the church fathers are unanimous on their attribution of the gospel loses some of its merit when we realize that this agreement doesn't begin until a century after the standard dating of the Gospels. Now, to be fair, we do have some early references of possible authorship, but it gets a bit tricky. This is where Papias enters. We don't know the actual writings of Papias, but Eusebius quotes him in the 4th century on a relevant matter. Eusebius records Papias as relating information about Matthew and Mark. For Mark, we are told that he was an interpreter of Peter, but didn't know Jesus. For Matthew, we are told that it was recorded in the Hebrew language, which most likely referred to Aramaic, as that was the common language of the time. There are a few problems here, though. Now, honestly, I'm not opposed to Mark having written the gospel attributed to him, but we have to take that carefully, because what is clear when we read Mark is that it couldn't all possibly be from the personal testimony of Peter. There are numerous instances in which what Mark records details ideas and events which Peter would have been absent. What seems more likely is that the author of Mark could have heard Peter preach and recorded some of that information, but also supplemented that with additional material, meaning the connection between Peter and Mark was most likely exaggerated. When it comes to Matthew, we have larger problems though. Mainly, our Gospel of Matthew was not written in Aramaic, it was written in Greek. So whatever Papias may have been discussing, he wasn't specifically mentioning the gospel we have today. However, there may still be something here. While the Gospel of Matthew we have today was not written in Aramaic, that doesn't mean that there wasn't some Aramaic source that was used that had been attached to Matthew. So we are getting into the realm of speculation here, but it's a reasonable speculation. There's a few things that make this idea rather possible. First, it's quite possible that we can actually see signs of an Aramaic source. Maurice Casey, building off the work of others in his book Aramaic Sources of Mark's Gospel, attempts to reconstruct exactly that, the Aramaic sources that underlies portions of Mark's Gospel. A good case can then be made for there having been some Aramaic source material. This is where we get into the second point. Writing in the ancient world was often a community endeavor, one in which it was common to compile sources. When we look at Matthew, we know that the author of the text utilized some sources. Most clearly, we can see how they used Mark. It's also suspected that they used another source that is shared with Luke, which is called Q. The reason for this is that Matthew and Luke share material, often word for word, that isn't found in Mark. So the suggestion is that they may have shared another source. But then we also have the unique material in Matthew that we find nowhere else. This is often called the M source. It's not that it necessarily all comes from a single source, but only that we refer to this unique material there. Could this material have included an Aramaic source? Well, maybe. If it had included material that was attached to Matthew, it's not a stretch to see why the entire gospel would then become attached to Matthew. It could also be that the Aramaic material in Mark came from the same Matthew that Papias cites. Like I said, this is speculating as we don't have firm evidence connecting everything here, but it's a reasonable possibility that's interesting to discuss. But the overall point here is that Mike's argument that the church fathers agree about the authorship of these texts is highly misleading and ignores the fact that for a century, these texts were not explicitly titled.
5. You know Paul, the guy who shaped most of Christian doctrines, he never really met Jesus in real life.
He met with Jesus' brother and close disciple, Peter.
I so dislike this argument. Paul is one of the most misunderstood individuals in Christian history, and there are a number of reasons for this. I think one of the major reasons for this is that he's been ripped from his Jewish background. A great work on this is Pamela Eisenbaum's book, Paul Was Not a Christian, the original message of a misunderstood apostle. But that's a slightly different topic, which we will definitely get into. The bigger issue here is the assumption that since we have preserved the letters of Paul, that means he was alone in what he was doing. He wasn't. Paul was just one of many individuals working within the Gentile mission. Paul himself actually tells us this. More so, we have good reason to assume that Paul submitted to the Jerusalem Council, which was composed of James, the brother of Jesus, and the disciples Peter and John. This is something he begrudgingly did, but he did nonetheless. There is a key point here, though, that is often overlooked. I mentioned that Paul is working within a Gentile mission. This is so very important, but so often ignored. Paul's big argument here is that those who enter the Jesus movement do not have to convert to Judaism. That doesn't mean that Judaism is irrelevant or that he gave up on it. Not at all. But instead he sees this movement spreading beyond just Judaism. And he does this based on his Jewish belief that at the end of time, every knee and nation will bow before God. This is a sentiment that Paul borrows from Hebrew scripture. More than this, though, Paul seems to model himself after Jeremiah, who was also commissioned to go before the nations. Since so much of this is often unknown or ignored, Paul, being stripped away from his context, is so often demonized or misrepresented. Paul does not create or define Christian doctrine. He was just one among many who were working within a Gentile mission that was overseen by the Jerusalem Council. The difference with Paul is simply that he wrote letters that were preserved, and because of that, people often build up his importance far beyond what it really was. Mike doesn't deal with any of this, though, which is a bit disappointing. But he's right. Paul does meet James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter and John, disciples of Jesus. Now, we can actually build this up a bit because a Greek here in Galatians 1:18 makes it clear that when he met Peter, it wasn't just to idle chit-chat. Instead, the term used here is historicist. Now, this term will actually evolve into the modern word history, and this suggests that Paul was learning from Peter, that he was getting acquainted with Peter. And this wasn't just a short visit either, it's one that lasted for 15 days. But there's a bit more to this discussion, so let's see how it goes.
And yet his version of the story is what Christians follow today.
That's completely false. The story of Jesus comes from the Gospels, which Paul did not write.
This was a letdown as Mike doesn't really make an argument. Again, he just kind of dismisses the whole point. Now, the idea that the version of Christianity that we follow is the one Paul created, as already discussed, is false. But you can't simply wave away that point. You need to actually dive into it and discuss it. Because if the argument is, Paul just made it up, that he created the movement as we see today, the implication is that the Gospels would have taken Paul's lead here. But if we see Paul as who he was, just one individual in a larger movement who happens to be remembered because he not only wrote numerous letters, but they were lucky enough to even be preserved, then we can see that his importance is often overinflated simply because of almost sheer accident. To wave this all away and say, "No, we use the Gospels," really misses the point and doesn't actually address the heart of the matter. It also ignores the issues with the Gospels, which, as we already saw, Mike also just swiped away. What's the next point, though?
6. The earliest artifact calling Jesus God is a Roman mosaic from the 3rd century.
Again, so what? That doesn't mean Jesus never existed.
This is a bad argument on both sides. When it comes to the original creator, though, it's a bad argument as it deals with a separate subject than what she was originally discussing. That Jesus possibly wasn't seen as God until the 3rd century doesn't mean Jesus didn't exist. It would just mean that Jesus wasn't seen as being divine until much later. The divinity of Jesus and the historicity of Jesus are two very separate topics. This point also highlights a different issue, though. There is a misunderstanding of how historical research is done. It places an oversized importance on archaeological evidence. While it is great to have archaeological evidence, the fact is, we don't have that for most of history. In this case specifically, though, the fact that we have earlier texts that portrayed Jesus as divine really supersedes any archaeological evidence that could be out there. Now, these are ideas that Mike could have discussed, but instead, he uses his primary tactic. He swipes it away. Instead of trying to have a real conversation and to see where the other side is coming from or what they're truly trying to say, he just ignores it. Because his goal isn't to reach out to the other side and create something of worth. He prevents that from even happening from the get-go because of his attitude. Instead, he's just angrily speaking into an echo chamber. This becomes most clear with how he decides to finish off.
Look, if you want to hold to the whack job theory that Jesus never existed.
What does become clear here is that he doesn't take the other side seriously. He looks down on them and demeans them. This is a major issue with apologetics. They don't see the other side as equals. They see them as less than. Instead of trying to find some unity, to find some understanding, they spend so much time promoting division while lifting themselves up onto a pillar. They ignore what we are told to do so, which is to love our neighbors and our enemies. And they ignore the epistle of James, where it tells us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. As Christians, we can do better than ridicule, dismissing other views, and refusing to actually engage in them. Now, if you actually want to engage in these discussions, give me a like, give me a follow, and we'll continue this sort of discussion in the next video.